So thank you so much for joining. I think we're ready to start. I will be taking the Q&A. So if you have any questions during the presentation, feel free to write them in the Q&A chat box in the bottom, and I will interrupt Professor Sandy Pepper and ask him the questions you may have. So thank you so much, and I leave the word to Sandy Pepper.
Claudia, thank you very much, and hello everybody, wherever you may be. I hope you're all keeping well in these rather strange times that we're living in. So I'm talking to you from my study at home in a place called Guildford, which is 30 miles south of London. And I haven't done this before. I haven't taught on Zoom yet this year, so I hope it's all going to go well, but you'll forgive me if there are one or two teething troubles along the way. So let me say a little bit about myself, and then I'm going to say a little bit about the topic I'm going to talk about today. So I am a professor of management practice at the LSE. Management practice, being a professor of practice, this means I had a previous life. I used to be a partner at PwC, and I was global head of the HR consulting practice for a number of years. And then about 12 years ago, I decided that the time had come to try something else, and an opportunity came to go to the LSE, where I've been teaching for the last 11 and a half years. And I'm interested in all sorts of things, but I teach a course in general management and operation theory that Claudia knows very well. So I'm interested in economics and organization theory, and most recently in business ethics as well. So I'm going to be teaching a new course in business ethics in the autumn. Let me then talk about my topic for today. Now, there's a bit of a story behind this topic. We were due to be hosting at the LSE the SEMS Global Strategy Board at the beginning of May, and we had planned to have an alumni conference alongside that, and we were going to have a keynote speech given by Minouche Shafiq, who is the director of the LSE, the equivalent of the president or the vice chancellor, if you like. We call our leader at the LSE the director, and she's an economist, and I was tasked with coming up with a topic for her to talk about. So I thought I'd give her a nice difficult topic to talk about, and I came up with this title, Anti-globalisation, Doing Business in a World That's Going Backwards. Now, of course, that alumni conference is no longer going ahead, sadly, and Minouche is not giving her talk. And a couple of weeks ago, Claudia asked me if I would be prepared to talk to all of you on this webinar, and she said it very nicely, and so of course I said yes. And then she cleverly said, well, perhaps this was quite a good title, so perhaps I'd like to talk to this title. So I say all this because I hadn't originally envisaged being the person that was going to speak to this subject. I was hoping that somebody far wiser and more senior than me, namely Dame Minouche Shafiq, was going to do it, but here we go. So here I am. So let me start by saying I'm going to make two assumptions at the beginning of this talk. The first assumption is that history matters, and the second assumption is that we can't predict the future. We can't predict the future, but that doesn't mean that we can't think about the future. So let me say a bit more about those two assumptions. So the first one is, the first question is, does history matter? And I believe that it does, but I need to qualify that in certain respects. So some of you will be familiar with some of the thinking of Karl Marx, his notion of what he calls dialectical materialism, drawn from the work of the German philosopher Hegel. And Marx believed that history was an inevitable process, that something happened, the antithesis of that happened, there was a reaction or rebellion against it, And then we ended up with a synthesis which somehow combined the best of what had gone before. And his argument, his belief was that the revolutionary period at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century was going to lead to a new kind of economy and a new kind of society that would replace capitalism. And of course, everybody thought that was had been proven wrong with the decline of the Soviet Union and the coming down of the Berlin Wall in 1990. Now, there are some people who argue actually Karl Marx was right and he just got his timing wrong, and maybe some of the things that are going on in the world today are the revolution or the synthesis of what's gone on before, that is going to lead to a different kind of economy and a different kind of society. So that's Karl Marx. Karl Popper, a famous philosopher at the LSE. He was German or Austrian philosopher who came to the LSE after the Second World War and was instrumental in setting up the LSE's Department of Scientific Method and Philosophy. And he wrote a very famous book in 1957 called The Poverty of Historicism. So he was cocking a snoot. He was sort of touting at Karl Marx in the title of his books. Karl Marx had written a book called The Poverty of Philosophy, and Karl Popper was criticizing Karl Marx's position in his book, The Poverty of Historicism. And Karl Popper said, we can't know the future. We can't possibly know the future because to know the future, we would have to know today what we won't know until tomorrow. So he was saying that the future is very much determined by scientific development. And if we knew the science today, then clearly we would have it and the future would already be happening. So technology, science has such an impact on the way that the world develops. And by definition, we can't know about tomorrow's inventions. So how can we therefore predict the future? So he was very strongly of the view that this kind of historicism that Karl Marx talked about was not correct. And then the third person, less famous than the other two, a man called Douglas North, an American economic historian. He said in his book, Understanding the Process of Economic Change, that history does matter to some extent, but not to the extent that Karl Marx thought. So history is the future is not determined, but what happens in the past has some impact on what happens in the future. What Douglas North said is, first of all, there is this concept which he calls path dependency. So choices that we make in the past affect the choices that we are able to make in the future. That if we decide we're going to do X in the past, then that limits our future choices to little x's. If we've decided not to do Y, then we don't have the possibility necessarily of doing Y in the future. And some of you will have heard of a poem by the American Robert Frost about the road not taken, a lovely poem about the road not taken. And in a sense, what Robert Frost was saying is, you make certain choices in your life, and those choices have some implications for the choices that you can make in the future. So Douglas North is similarly saying decisions that that have been made in the past by us and by others will have an impact on the possibilities that exist for the future. And just to develop that, he talks about this idea that we can look at phenomenon that have happened in the past, and we can theorize about them, and those phenomena will help to explain phenomena of the present and potentially phenomena of the future, because there is this path that runs from one to another. So I hope you're still with me. What I'm trying to develop here is the idea that if we look at the history of the last 100 years or so, the economic and business history of the last 100 years or so, we are going to find potentially some important clues to what is going to happen in the future in the next 10 or 20 years. So that's my first assumption. History does matter to some extent. But then my second assumption is actually it's very difficult to predict the future. Indeed, you can't really predict the future. You can build scenarios about the future, and I'm going to explain to you a very famous way of futurizing that has been used extensively by Royal Dutch Shell and has at times given them a real competitive advantage in the markets that they operate in. But they don't try to predict, they try to think about the future and develop possible scenarios for the future, but they don't seek to rely on, you know, one specific prediction of how things might be. And here's another famous economist, John Kenneth Galbraith, whose view on economic forecasting was, as he says here, makes astrology look respectable. But as I say, a bit like history matters, but only to some extent, I'm going to argue that even though you can't predict the future, you can develop possible scenarios for the future, and doing that can be a very helpful way of preparing for what happens next. So those are my two assumptions and why I'm making those assumptions. So as I say, even though you can't predict the future, excuse me, while I just turn my notes over, even though I can't predict the future, and here's another Karl Popper phrase, it's logically impossible to know the future course of history when that course depends on part on the future growth of scientific knowledge, which is unknowable in advance. That's Karl Popper's thesis. However, I'm going to argue that you can still imagine possible futures. Now, this man, Pierre Wack, who was an executive at Shell in the 1960s and 70s, he developed a way of thinking when he was head of Shell's strategy department called the scenarios method, a way of thinking about the future, which is more important than prediction. And just to try and explain this, if you think about athletes preparing for races or musicians preparing for concerts, they don't just turn up at the race or turn up at the concert having not thought about it beforehand. They will train extensively. They may even, depending on the way they like to prepare for races, they may even sit in a dark room and imagine how it's going to be, what it's going to be like when they get to the stadium and when they're on the starting blocks for the race, or they're a musician walking onto the stage about to play a piece of music to a large audience. So they might try to imagine themselves into that future on the basis that when the future actually happens, when they do it, they are much better prepared because of the training and the imagination that they have done to get themselves into the right frame of mind. David Ingvar, who's a Scandinavian scientist, he talked about the scenarios method that Pierre Wack had developed with this lovely phrase, memories of an anticipated future, the idea that actually when the future happens, you are better prepared because you have memories of the way that you have imagined the future might be. So we're not predicting because we recognize there are all sorts of possible futures, but we're kind of training for the future by trying out different scenarios. And that's what I'm going to try to do with you today. So back to the history. This graph, or these two graphs, were developed by two economic historians. One of them an American, Brad DeLong, the other interesting man, an Englishman who spent a lot of his time at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands, and he was a quantitative economist, but he he sort of developed this idea of actually we can draw information about what has, economic information about what has happened in the past by using all sorts of different historical evidence. And he wrote a number of very interesting books about that. So what this graph shows is that gross domestic product per head of the population over the period from 1600 to the beginning of this century, what you see is it was incredibly flat. There was very little growth in per capita gross domestic product until the early part of the 19th century, the 1800s. And then you see it begin to rise during the course of the 19th century. And then suddenly into the 20th century, particularly into the latter part of the 20th century, you see this exponential growth in world per capita gross domestic product. So per capita domestic product is, if you like, a way of representing wealth per person. And what this graph is showing is that the world's wealth, the world's economic wealth per person has grown extraordinarily fast in the course of the last 150 to 200 years. Here's a sort of a more detailed look at the latter part of that period, and this is just using the Angus Maddison historical data. And what I want to show you here is this period in the early part of the 20th century, when actually after some early rises that had occurred in the 19th century, it all kind of went flat. Until around 1945, the end of the Second World War. So between 1945 and 1950, at that point, economic growth really took off in a very substantial way. So why was that? Well, I'm going to suggest that there were three reasons why economic growth really took off after the Second World War in 1945. And the first reason is all to do with technology. And I'm going to illustrate that with the telephone. So there are three pictures: a telephone as it looked in 1930, the kind of landline that you would have in 1980, and you see the particular feature of that telephone, the 1980s telephone, was the way you had to dial numbers on a circular kind of clock. So not the press buttons that we have today, but this dialing mechanism that was quite slow because you used the circular clock. And then 2020, iPhones, you know, an extraordinary, powerful computer in a sense that we just can put in our pockets. Now, I'm old enough to remember when I got my first mobile phone. It was probably in the early 1990s. It was so big that I had a briefcase to carry it around in. And when you wanted to use it, you had to pull an aerial out, and sort of a bit like a radio, you had to put it up to your ear with this long aerial coming out of it. And, you know, everybody, I mean, this is just, what, 25 years ago, and the sort of speed of change in mobile telephony in the last part of the last 20 years or so has been quite extraordinary. And I'm just using telephony as a proxy for the development of technology generally. So we have technology today that we could not have possibly imagined, really, as little as sort of 20, 25 years ago when I was in the early part of my career. And indeed, technology, we've been learning all sorts of things about ways of communicating with each other in the course of the last 2 months because of the coronavirus, that again, we sort of hadn't possibly really realized we could do in such an effective way, you know, even as just a sort of a few weeks ago. So technology is, the development of science and technology has had an enormous impact on global growth. So that's my first reason for this period of growth, economic growth in the 20th century. And the next reason is travel. So here are 3 aeroplanes, one in the 1930s with its prop propeller, 1980, that's I think it's called a TriStar. It's got 2 jet engines and then one stuck on the back. I'm again old enough to have travelled on a TriStar, which is a fairly uncomfortable airplane to be on. And then 2020, that's one of the new Boeing Dreamliners, which I've also been on one of those actually, and I have to say it was an incredibly comfortable ride that I had. Aeroplane technology is quite interesting because it in fact hasn't developed at really quite the same pace that mobile telephony has. And indeed, I'm sure all of you will have been at some point on a Boeing 747, a jumbo jet. Jumbo jet still in service, still one of the mainstream carriers, global carriers. But actually the jumbo jet first entered service in January 1970, and essentially the same kind of technology as was being used in 1970 is still a big part of aeroplane technology today. So perhaps not the same speed of development as we've seen in mobile telephony. But the numbers of people that are traveling, let me just see if I can find a statistic for you. Might come to it later, but the availability of air travel has grown again quite exponentially in the course of the 20th century. So even if the technology hasn't developed so fast, nevertheless the availability of air travel has increased substantially, and that's the second reason I'm saying that the availability of global travel has really contributed to global growth. And then my third T is tariffs. And one of the things that we have seen during the course of the 20th century is a steep decline in the tariffs that individual countries impose upon the import of goods. So let's have a look at another graph. So this is sort of a history of tariffs in 3 countries, France, United Kingdom and the United States since 1830. And what you see here is quite interesting. So the light grey line is the United States. And you see that at the beginning of the 19th century, in 1830, actually tariffs in the United States were very high. They then declined, but then they went up again at the end of the 19th century. And throughout the 1920s and 1930s were still quite high. And it was only down towards 1950 that American tariffs really dropped to a very low level. What you see in the United Kingdom and France is a sort of a decline during the course of the 19th century, and apart from a period during the Second World War, or the lead up to the Second World War and the Second World War itself, we've seen much lower levels of tariffs. So the latter part of the 20th century, this point when global growth was growing very significantly, we were also operating in a very low tariff world. So let's think about this, the history of free trade. If we go back to the 15th and 16th century, the dominant economic theory, economic policy of the time was a thing called mercantilism. A man called Antonio Serra wrote a book called A Short Treatise on Wealth and Poverty of Nations, where he advocated setting up high tariffs between countries, and the aim of a country's economic policy should be, he said, to maximize exports and minimize imports, using tariff structures to do that, and to build up a big balance of payments surplus accordingly. So then we come to the 18th century, and the famous economist Adam Smith, who wrote his book, The Wealth of Nations. Note, he didn't talk about the poverty of nations, he talked about the wealth of nations. And he and one of his sort of subsequent sort of followers, David Ricardo, they were big advocates of free trade. They criticized the mercantilist notion. They believed that that was not the best way to bring about economic success and economic growth, and they strongly advocated free trade between nations. And the policies that they recommended gradually came about during the course of the 19th century, and a very symbolic moment in the United Kingdom was the abolition in 1846 of something called the Corn Laws, which had previously restricted food imports to the United Kingdom, and had meant that the landowners of the time, the UK landowners of the time, were able to, in their own inefficient ways, kind of secure their own positions, notwithstanding that much cheaper food would have been available if the UK had allowed food to be imported from other countries. So in 1846, Sir Robert Peel, a Conservative MP, against the wishes of his own party, brought about the abolition of the Corn Laws and the opening up of the UK economy to free trade. And here's a quote from an American economist, Gregory Mankiw. Any of you who've studied economics have probably used one of his textbooks at some point, and he says, "Few propositions command as much consensus among professional economists as the open world trade increases economic growth and raises living standards." So there you go, the history of free trade, the 19th century after the Battle of Waterloo, the end of the Napoleonic era, we had a gradual opening up of free trade. The world went a little bit into reverse at the beginning of the 20th century with the First World War, and then the period between the First and the Second World Wars. And then from 1945 onwards, we had the opening up of the world economy. And December 1978, interesting moment when in China, Deng Xiaoping's economic reforms and opening up of the Chinese economy led to the start of the what we might call the Chinese economic miracle. And so latter part of the 20th century, we've had this period of kind of unparalleled economic wealth, certainly in the Western developed world, and in China, and in and Southeast Asia. The Asian countries have benefited from the opening up of international trade. So now we get to the present moment, as I suppose, and the signs in the last couple of years of the beginning of protectionism. So Donald Trump's economic policy of America first, a trade war developing between the United States and China because of, primarily because of the Trump administration's America First policy. In 2016 in the UK, we had the vote to leave the European Union, and eventually the implementation of that policy with our new Prime Minister Boris Johnson in 2019. And then I'm suggesting that the worldwide COVID-19 pandemic as well perhaps is contributing to, or is a further step in the return of protectionism. Countries' borders have been locked down for reasons of public health, but one of the consequences of that has been the closing of borders for trade, and we have in many countries this huge economic slump that has developed very rapidly because of the closing down of our international borders. And if you look back at the tariffs chart that I showed a few moments ago, what seems to be happening is something like this, that tariffs are beginning to rise again, and maybe are going to continue to, with potentially negative implications for the global economy. So what happens next? So if that's the history, let's think about what's going to happen now. So do we want to pause for a moment, Claudia, and does anybody have any questions that they'd like to ask at this stage?
If you have questions, for the ones who joined later, just write them in the Q&A chat box and I will read them for you. But for now, there's nothing in the...
Okay, so I'll keep going, and we'll open up for questions in a few minutes. So I've talked about the past, the history, and now I'm going to talk about the future, what happens next. And as I said, predicting the future is a difficult thing to do. But one company, Shell, in the 1970s developed a way of thinking about the future, which they called scenarios, which I find fascinating. It's a fascinating kind of philosophy almost of how to develop your strategies and think about the future. And Shell have made this strategy very famous, and they the nice story, the nice Shell story is about something that happened in the 1970s. So Shell, Pierre Wack, the strategy department of Shell, they developed this method. It's, as I'm going to sort of illustrate it to you in a few moments, it's an interesting mixture of deductive and analytical thinking, of sort of inductive and synthetic development of resources and material. It's a way of thinking about the future rather than thinking about making one particular prediction about the future. And here's another scenario scholar's sort of way of describing it. He talks about it as setting test conditions in a wind tunnel for designing successful future strategies. And the way it works is this. You start, there's a sort of 6-stage process that you go through. You start by doing what we have done and looking back over the past and identifying some of the key trends that we see which have impacted upon the economic development over the course of the last 25 to 50 years. I've used a longer period of time than that. And then from our examination of the past, we identify the key trends that have affected the economic development of the world in the past. And we think about how those trends, which of those trends might be important for the future. And then comes the very kind of piece of deductive logic. You pick the 2 most significant trends as you see them, and you conduct a 2x2 matrix, giving you 4 possible scenarios based upon those 2 trends. And then you build up narratives around those 4 scenarios. And those, if you like, those 4 scenarios, they become the kind of your imagination of the future, the possible futures that you might see and that you help to develop your strategic policies against. And you can go into great levels of detail about this. You can build first level scenarios, as they're called, which are sort of quite high level. You can build design scenarios that are very specific to your companies and what the future scenarios mean for your companies. And then you can start making decisions, including something called real options, that actually start to mean that your company policies are affected by the way that you have thought about the future. And if you just go back to the metaphor I used earlier, you know, the musician walking onto the platform about to play a piece of music, this is like that musician having 4 possible ways in which things might go. Or it might be the athlete and running a race, and they've thought carefully about 4 different ways that the race might develop. And so as the race does actually develop, they can pick upon whichever of those 4 scenarios seems closest to the situation that they're actually in, and they can use the rehearsal that they've done beforehand about that particular scenario to help them as they try to carry out whatever the actions are that they need in the particular circumstances. And the very famous story about Shell was this, that Shell, one of the Shell scenarios in the 1970s was the possibility that there might be a world economic oil crisis. So the early 1970s, the oil markets, the world oil markets were very open, working very successfully. There was lots of oil around. Oil price was relatively low. Well, it was very low, in fact. And that was one of the things that was helping to really sort of provide a great stimulus for economic growth. And then in 1973, we had an oil crisis when the Middle Eastern oil producing companies, OPEC, for political reasons, basically turned off the supply of oil. And they particularly had a problem with the United States and with the Netherlands, and they really limited supply of oil to those 2 countries. And the oil price rose from something like $23 a barrel to something like $80 a barrel over a very short period of time. And a consequence of that, of course, was that the amount of oil that was moving around the world at the time reduced very significantly. Now, most oil companies move oil around the world using tankers, oil tankers. They may own those tankers, or very often they just charter the tankers. And Shell was a big charterer of tankers and had entered into contracts, which meant they had lots of available tanker space. But because of the oil crisis, their need for that tanker space suddenly overnight reduced very significantly. And as you can imagine, hiring an oil tanker is an expensive thing to do. And if you had oil tanker storage space that you didn't need, that had negative consequences for your business. But because Shell had anticipated the possibility of an oil crisis, they had cleverly negotiated with their charter parties, with the shipping companies that owned tankers. They cleverly negotiated options that allowed them to exit from their charter parties in circumstances of Shell's own choosing. And when Shell had originally gone to the shipping companies and asked for those options, those exit options, the shipping companies have been very happy to provide them because they, at the time, the demand for oil was so high that the demand for tanker space was very high as well. And they really didn't anticipate that that was going to change. So Shell, because of these exit options on its shipping charters, was able to save an enormous amount of money, and in contrast to the other oil majors of the time, was able to keep its transport costs very much under control at a time when the supply of oil was reduced as well. So there's an example of a real option created by a company because of a design scenario that they'd entered into that helped them to think about the future.
Sorry, Professor, we have 2 questions. So
Okay.
One from Malaika, she asked to spend a few words on the last graph. I suppose it's the one about tariffs. So
Yeah.
can you explain that one? And another one from Jaron asking, have there been similar events in the past that we could look at for building scenarios for the future, like global pandemics as well as trade wars? And what was the impact then? Additional tariffs, etc.
Okay, so I'm going to come to the second question in a minute, but let's go back to that one, I think. Yeah. So what was the question again? So
one from Malaika was, can you explain the last graph? And the other one was, have there been similar events in the past that we could get for building scenarios? So what I'm trying to suggest here is that the y axis is the average tariff rates. So these are the
the import duties that were being paid on imports of goods into particular countries. So the average tariff on imports into America in 1830 were as much as 50% of the value of the goods being imported. So huge discouragement to people who were trying to export goods to America. And what you see over the course of the sort of 150, 200 years is how these tariffs have moved down over the course of time with a few sort of bumps along the way, so that for the latter part of the 20th century, we had average tariff rates that were very low across the developed world. And my suggestion is that that has helped to fuel global growth. And my further suggestion is that possibly we are seeing a change in global tariff policies, and potentially the rise of tariffs to higher levels. And I'm further suggesting that that could have a negative impact on global economic growth, if that makes a bit more sense. So that was the graph. And then if I go back to the past and the future, wait a minute. So the trends, so here are the trends that I see emerging from the discussion that we've had about the past. So we've seen, as I say, this decline in protectionism until the last few years, when maybe protectionism and tariffs and trade wars have started to feature again in terms of the global economy. And we've seen growth in popularism and nationalism. You know, the Trump government, I mean, you know, just sort of around the world, the Trump government, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Narendra Modi in India, perhaps Boris Johnson in the UK, kind of a focus on America first, or Britain first, or Brazil first, or India, you know, Hindu first, as opposed to the kind of open thinking that characterized the 80s and the 90s and the early part of this century. We've seen this rapid rise in technology, especially communications technology, and maybe the beginning signs of green technology as well. We've seen this huge explosion in air travel until recently, and I've suggested that air travel, the ability to travel cheaply around the world, is another thing that has contributed to global growth. We've seen an explosion in migration. So world migration, we've got some figures here, 79 million according to the UN in 1960, 100 million people migrating per year in 1980. In 2020, before the COVID-19 crisis, the UN was predicting global migration of 258 million. And lastly, global pandemics. Well, the interesting story is the Spanish flu, which occurred after the First World War. I have some statistics about the Spanish flu. No, I don't. But the Spanish flu, a pandemic that developed just at the end of the First World War, was unkindly called the Spanish flu because its origins seem to come from Spain, but to spread around the rest of Europe. And the Spanish flu famously killed more people than had died in the course of all the terrible battles that took place during the First World War. And again, there is evidence that the Spanish flu was one of the things that damped down international trade at the beginning of the 20th century. So what I've done is taken those trends. I've taken two trends, a technology trend and a globalism, nationalism trend, and I've used those trends to develop 4 possible scenarios. So if I take the x-axis here, at the top I'm saying that maybe we will use technology in a way that will add to sustainability and help to solve the climate crisis. Or conversely, maybe there will be a reversion to the kind of heavy industry type technology that has been one of the big contributors to the global climate crisis. So the triumph of sustainable technology, I call it, or the Pyrrhic victory. The King Pyrrhus was a Greek leader who won battles against the Romans, and yet he lost so many men in the course of the battles that ultimately his success in battle caused him to lose the whole war. So a Pyrrhic victory, maybe because we're good at technology, the kind of technology that we're good at ultimately is self-defeating and contributes heavily to climate change. So which way is it going to go? Are you going to go the way of the triumph of sustainable technology or the Pyrrhic victory of unsustainable technology? And the globalism, nationalism axis, so the question is, are we going to go back to the kind of free trade and positive approach to globalism that was a hallmark of the latter part of the 20th century? Or are we seeing a regression to the kind of nationalistic policies that were characteristic of the first part of the 20th century? So those 2 axes, those sort of 4 possibilities, gives us 4 possible worlds. So I've called one the green world, where we go back to the kind of open trade policies of the latter part of the 20th century, and we use technology in new ways that helps to solve the global climate crisis. Or the blue world, where we do well with technology, bit like we're doing now. The Zoom technology that we're using at the moment, maybe as a replacement for international travel or to complement international travel, may be quite a neat way of helping to reduce our carbon footprints. But that combined with the kind of nationalistic policies, high trade barriers, and that sort of thing that we may have seen from the Trump policies and the Boris Johnson policies and so forth. So those are worlds with positive technologies, as it were, but different positions in terms of free trade. And then the other 2 worlds, the pink world and the red world. So the red world's the really bad one. The red world's where we revert to unsustainable types of technology, and we also regress to nationalism. And I'm suggesting that the consequences of that could be quite negative, or the kind of halfway house where we at least revert to globalism, but we still are wedded to old-fashioned technologies. So 4 possible worlds, and what would be quite good is just to get some thoughts and questions from you all now about whether you think those 4 worlds are attractable, you know, whether you think my analysis is a sensible one. Are there any other trends that you think are more important? And what you think the implications are if any of those scenarios that I've talked about actually comes about. So the anti-globalisation topic was, you know, if we end up here in the red world, I'm suggesting to you that has all sorts of negative connotations for prosperity and indeed climate change, that my generation is going to foist upon your generation in terms of fixing, or, you know, what's the possibility of us moving up here where we go back to our more open borders approach, and we also use technology in sustainable ways to help manage climate change better in future. So can I pause there and ask if anyone wants to comment or ask any
So first of
questions.
all, sorry to interrupt, we have 3 questions. They're quite long, so should I ask you one by one?
Yeah, ask me one by one. Yeah.
Yeah, perfect. So there's one from Inzu, and it is, what's your opinion concerning the current situation of oil price slumped even to negative? Investors suffer while certain companies are buying a large amount of oil, with the thinking that the economy will slowly recover. The demand for oil will increase dramatically. What will be the predicted future in this way and the influence of oil price?
So if we go back to our 4 scenarios, so in the green world, maybe actually the green world is about losing our reliance upon oil. Maybe what we are seeing today is the end of the domination of world economics by oil companies and the need for oil. Maybe here is an opportunity for us all to start really developing new ways of behaving and new ways of doing things that rely upon greener technologies that ultimately could help to solve the climate crisis. So there is an economic geographer at Oxford University called Danny Dorling, who some of you may have heard of. He's a fairly left-wing economic geographer, and he's written a book very recently which builds upon the COVID-19 crisis, and he's actually quite optimistic that it may be one of the things that causes everybody to stop and think about the implications of things like climate change and cause us really to accelerate the development of new technologies and the use of new technologies that will mean that we're no longer reliant upon oil, and the kind of the heavy industries that underpin the oil industry and can have such a negative impact in terms of the climate. Maybe we are beginning to see the decline of those industries and the negative consequences that flows from them. So that would be one, that would be one view, one possible scenario that we might like to think around. Much more negative scenario would be, this is a temporary blip. Once we've solved the COVID-19 pandemic crisis, we'll all go back to being heavy users of oil and diesel and all that kind of stuff, and we'll get back on our aeroplanes and fly around the world and have high carbon footprints as we had done, only a few months ago. So it could go either way. Who knows? Your guess is as good as mine.
Perfect, thanks so much. There's one question from Francesco, and he's asking, what does the situation with Shell and its tanker contracts look like now that there's an oil crisis and lack of storage space?
So it's a very interesting question. I don't know the answer to it. You'll have seen that I showed earlier a copy of the cover of a book called The Shell Scenarios that ran to 2020. So that's a published book that you can buy and you can read the way that they had imagined the future sort of 20 years ago, and it ran up to 2020. I don't know what the Shell scenario process has predicted for the present time. I don't know whether Shell had anticipated the possibility of another oil shock or a global pandemic like this one. If they had done, then I could well imagine that they had entered into, they'd taken options over things like storage space for oil that would potentially put them in quite a good position relative to their competitors. But I don't know precisely what Shell has done. What I do know is that, so at Oxford University, the Side Business School in Oxford, there is a small group of scenarios specialist academics led by a man called Rafael Ramirez. and they have been advertising their consulting abilities quite widely in the last few weeks, with the view to kind of helping companies think about the future by using their scenario thinking to help with the strategic planning and strategizing.
Perfect, thanks so much. We have one question from Kirsten Schutz asking, I'm confused as to the thesis of returning tariff rates on such a large scale. Would it not be political suicide in at least the medium term to harm the economy of a country in such a way as imposing large tariffs would? Even in the past, only a world war, for example, global political crisis, was able to bring this.
Well, so I think it's a very interesting question. If you look at American trade policy at the moment, there is a view that has developed over the past few years alongside the Donald Trump presidency that says actually low tariffs have been bad for certain parts of the global of the American economy, and particularly have contributed to the decline of heavy industry in America, the Rust Belt, the development of the Rust Belt in America. And one of Donald Trump's arguments seems to be a reversion to old style mercantilism. He seems to be arguing it would be better for America if actually they didn't import so much steel from other parts of the world, and the American steel industry, the old-fashioned, inefficient American steel industry, was protected and was allowed to redevelop, and jobs might therefore return to parts of the American Rust Belt. So a protectionist policy designed to help prop up industries that otherwise have gone into decline in the United States. Now, many free market economists would argue that there are all sorts of reasons why that is a bad economic policy, but you can see how, from a political point of view, if you take a particularly narrow standpoint, it might be believed by some people, including the President of the United States, that actually this would be a good way to regenerate certain parts of the American economy. Of course, the piece that's missing in that thinking is if you raise tariffs and stop people exporting to your country, then the natural thing for them to do is to respond and to stop you, to limit your ability to sell your products in their country. And you have the development of tariffs in, let's say, China, as a kind of marker to the United States that if the Americans are going to limit the importation of Chinese steel, for example, then the Chinese are going to respond by limiting the import into China of American goods. And this kind of tit-for-tat trade war is something that in the latter part of the 20th century have been noticeable by its absence, and sort of world institutions have largely managed to keep trade wars to a relatively low level. But what we have seen in the past couple of years is the resurrection of some of these protectionist type of trade practices. I am a subscriber essentially to free trade, but you can see how some people might end up in a position where they make these decisions that actually ultimately can be quite harmful.
Thanks so much. So just a reminder, we have to return the account at 2:10, so we'll ask you a couple more questions. The other ones, please feel free to send them to me, and if Stanley Pepper agrees, I can send them to him in the afternoon for him to reply via email, if that's okay. I will
I'm very happy to do that.
one or two more questions and see if it's, and the other ones I will make sure that they'll be answered by email, if that's
okay.
There's one question asking, since we're already talking about unsustainable technology, what is your personal opinion on about 5G?
So if this is a question about, well, so there's all sorts of things about 5G, aren't there? There's the question of privacy and freedom, and whether 5G threatens our personal freedoms in the way that it kind of would allow somebody in a central position to watch over us and trace our movements. There's another, there's the more sort of exotic theory that seems to be knocking around at the moment, that 5G has somehow contributed to the COVID-19 pandemic. And whilst I'm not a scientist, I'm scientific enough, I think, to see that that must be totally spurious and imagined by people who have very peculiar beliefs. So I'm not going to talk about that one. And then the other thing about 5G is the political question about whether we should allow other jurisdictions, other countries to set up, be responsible for parts of our 5G system, and whether that could lead to kind of undesirable outcomes because that other country might have the ability to spy on us or take the system down at some point if they were so inclined. What's my thinking about all of that? As I say, I will discard the peculiar theories about 5G and COVID-19. I think I'm not going to comment on whether Huawei should be allowed to have part of the UK 5G network. I can kind of, I mean, I am by inclination a free trader, and in many ways I think that should, because of my belief in free trade, we should be open to the idea that countries that have better technologies than we do should be free to allow those technologies to be imported into our systems. But let me come back. Let me come back to the first one, because I do think it's quite interesting, and I think there are some quite big philosophical issues about whether 5G technology takes mobile telephony to a stage that it could be quite intrusive in our personal lives. I think it's probably quite important that there is something of a national debate about the way that 5G technology is used, and that there are regulatory safeguards placed upon companies to make sure that 5G technology does not interfere too much with our personal liberties. So, you know, technology is a good thing if used in the right way and if focused on the right kind of problems. But it is quite important that we are not blind to the potential misuse of technology, and that countries have good enough regulatory systems to try and make sure that important things like civil liberties are not too much interfered with.
Perfect, thank you so much. So I would call it a day because it's already 2:09. Thank you so much, professors, for your time. And I will forward the questions to Fanny Pepper in the afternoon. Please, if you have any more questions, just answer the email I sent last night about the Zoom link, and I will forward them the questions. So please do this by, let's say, 11:59 p.m. tonight. So maybe I can send them to him tomorrow morning. So
okay,
thank you so much all for your time, and thank you again, professors, for this.
Okay, cheerio, everybody.
Thanks so much.